Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Before we begin, let me remind you that our weekly explained session goes live on our YouTube channel at 8 p.m. today. The topic for discussion would be One Nation, One Election, and the session would be conducted by Sarmad sir. So don't forget to tune into our channel at 8 p.m. to catch the session live. Now let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by first looking at a few important editorials and columns. The first column is from page number 6 and it deals with the monopoly of the big tech companies and the possible abuse of their dominant position in the market. See, the term big tech refers to the giant internet companies largely based out of the United States, such as Facebook, Google, Apple, Amazon, etc. See, these big tech companies have become so dominant and so large that they are often referred to as countries or governments on their own. For example, Apple's market capitalization stands at more than $2 trillion, which in fact is more than the GDP of many countries. WhatsApp has a subscriber base of more than 2 billion people, and if it were to be a country, it would be the largest country. So this widespread dominance of these big tech companies has raised fears about their monopolistic power and the potential that exists for the abuse of their dominant position. So these concerns have triggered several investigations around the world against these big tech companies, including in the European Union and the United States. Due to their widespread reach, they have often been accused of enabling the spreading of fake news and have even been criticized for failing to act against extremist ideologies which flourish on their platforms. There have even been incidents where these companies have been involved in the breach of the data privacy of their users, and they are also known to pursue aggressive anti-competitive policies. So in short, these big tech companies are having a massive political, social and economic impact on the world. So this has triggered several investigations against them, and governments and regulators around the world are exploring options to control their behavior. In the US and the European Union, many of these big tech companies are even facing antitrust investigations, which looks into anti-competitive practices and even penalizes those companies that are killing competition in an unfair manner. The writer says that these ongoing antitrust investigations around the world against the big tech companies reminds us of the antitrust investigation against American telecom giant AT&T, which eventually resulted in the breakup of the company by the Department of Justice in 1982. Back then, AT&T had become too large for its own good, and it was seen to be abusing its monopoly position. So the Department of Justice acted against it, and AT&T and its services were broken up into smaller fragments in the spirit of keeping competition alive in the economy. So one would hope that the current ongoing antitrust investigations against the big tech companies could end up providing a similar result as seen in 1982 against AT&T. But however, the writer points out there are key differences between the telecom industry and the internet-based industry, and it is highly unlikely that the US authorities are going to break up the big tech companies. There are three key differences that the writer highlights. The first difference is that the telecom business is inherently a rival business. Because in telecom, due to limited network capacity, the consumption by one player has an effect of decreasing the value for the others. Hence, it's a business which is rival in nature. Whereas in internet-based business, the companies are offering information as a good because the consumption of information by one does not alter the value for the others. The second difference is that telecom operators, they operate within a confined jurisdiction, that is within a geographical boundary, and hence it is much easier to regulate them and enforce these regulations on them. Whereas on the other hand, internet-based firms, they have a global jurisdiction due to the very nature of the internet, and this creates jurisdictional issues when it comes to their regulation, and it becomes very tough to enforce the regulations on them. And third, telecom business is seen as an excludable business because the customers are paying a charge to the service provider. Whereas the internet business is seen as non-excludable because the consumers are not paying any direct charges to these big tech companies for using their goods and services. But however, there arises a complexity while classifying them as non-excludable, because for availing these free services from the internet-based companies, the customers have to provide a trade-off in the form of their data, that is their personal data. These big tech companies, they harvest vast quantities of user data which they eventually monetize by providing for targeted or personalized advertisements or by sharing the personal information of the users with other third parties. See, generally, when a good or a service is classified as non-rival and non-excludable, they are generally treated as a public good, and this largely exempts them from strict regulation, and it even makes them eligible for government tax subsidies. For example, traditionally it's the government which provides for public goods such as roads, streetlights, police protection, etc. And the cost for this is borne by the taxpayers. So such public goods which serve a public purpose, they are seen as non-rival and non-excludable, and hence they do not face the same amount of scrutiny and regulation as compared to businesses which are rival in nature and which are seen as excludable. That's why the writer says that the current antitrust investigations which are going on against the big tech firms might not result in the breakup of their monopoly, unlike what we saw in the case of AT&T in 1982. But even though these internet firms are non-rival and non-excludable, there arises a complexity because they are extracting user data and harvesting it on a large scale, and they are eventually monetizing it. So even though the users are not directly paying a charge for using the goods and services of these firms, they are indirectly trading their data which is getting monetized, thereby bringing large revenues to these multinational corporations. So this is where a legal gray area arises, and that's the reason why countries around the world are pursuing data protection laws in order to guarantee the data rights and the data privacy of the users. Such monetization of user data creates the need for regulating these big tech firms, because eventually the motive of profit could push these companies to exploit their monopoly position and to abuse their dominant position. Another alarming concern is with regard to their large market share. See, most of these big tech companies are based on the concept of social networking. So the very foundation of their product is built on strong network effect, and their very business model is dependent on their ability to add more and more users. So this naturally pushes the big tech companies towards monopoly, because as their user base expands due to the strong network effect, they eventually end up gaining a dominant position in the market. So a few initial companies which take the lead, they end up establishing a monopoly, and at any cost they would try to retain their pole position, even at the risk of resorting to anti-competitive behavior. This trend has been widely noticed in the world of big tech, and these companies are known to stifle competition through various unethical practices. There have been several incidents involving these big tech companies where they have adopted predatory policies towards their rivals, and in order to stifle competition, they have tried to push the smaller companies towards forceful merger and acquisition. Then, to prevent the rise of new competition, they are even known to erect several entry barriers, and in many cases they have even refused to cooperate and interconnect and interoperate their networks with their competing firms. These predatory policies of the big tech firms that has been noticed has been designed to drive out competition. But despite all these drawbacks and threats, the products and services that are offered by these big tech companies, they have become an indispensable part of our lives. Because it is also true that their products and services have several advantages to the society and the economy, and it has also revolutionized and decentralized the economy in the favor of the customers. See, I'm sure for most of us, tools like Google Maps have become indispensable while we are traveling. And this benefits not only the individual users, but even entire sectors of the economy have come to depend on them. For example, around the world, logistics and transport companies, they have all built their applications by making use of the Google Maps API. Take for example, startups such as Ola and Uber. They have built their logistics and transport companies based on the API provided by Google Maps. Similarly, several small businessmen and self-made entrepreneurs rely heavily upon targeted and personalized advertisements that are delivered through Facebook, Instagram, etc. So there is no denying that the products of big tech companies have been largely advantageous for the society and the economy, and even their customers, they have become bound to their services. See, for example, if you look at the latest controversy involving the privacy policy of WhatsApp, most of us made an attempt to switch to alternative platforms such as Signal and Telegram. Even though we have started using other alternative platforms, we still continue to use WhatsApp as well, because a large part of our social network, that includes our friends, families and colleagues, they are still dependent on WhatsApp and they're still using the platform. And this binds us as a customer to these big tech companies. So considering these advantages and positive externalities and customer dependency, it becomes almost impossible for the authorities to ban these platforms due to their violations. So on one side, there is an urgent need to regulate these companies in order to prevent them from abusing their dominant position and in order to prevent them from resorting to anti-competitive behavior. But at the same time, their platforms are hugely advantageous for the society. And by keeping all these factors in mind, any regulatory policy should try to strike a fine balance between these objectives. So there are a few solutions that are available in order to strike such a balance. For starters, the government can start providing an incentive to the big tech companies in the form of tax subsidies, and in return it can mandate them to behave in an orderly manner and operate within the confines of the law of the land. Then to leverage the socio-economic benefits offered by these companies, the government can mandate and regulate the sharing of non-personal data of the users. For example, the Indian government has set up one such committee under Chris Gopalakrishnan, one of the co-founders of Infosys, to come out with suggestions for regulating the sharing and usage of non-personal data. The government can go ahead and implement these regulations that provides for both monetization of non-personal data and as well as the protection of data privacy of the users. Such a balanced regulation policy will help us extract the socio-economic benefits that are offered by these big tech companies, while at the same time regulating their behavior and conduct. Another example would be the latest laws brought in by the Australian government that mandates the big tech firms to provide for fair payment to media outlets and news outlets for utilizing their content on their platforms. Then the government and the regulatory authorities should also rely upon the power of the public and the power of the consumers in order to keep the behavior of these big tech companies under check. One such incident was witnessed in India in 2015 when Facebook was promoting its free basics program known as internet.org. Under this initiative, Facebook had claimed to provide free internet services or internet services at very affordable costs in order to connect the remote areas and the unconnected areas. Under the initiative, Facebook was planning to provide access to few limited websites which are seen as essential, and it was planning to offer these services either free of cost or at affordable prices in the remote and unconnected areas. While this was the stated objective of Facebook, this project of Facebook did raise a lot of concerns with regard to net neutrality. Because the fear of the civil society and the activists was that Facebook could misuse its dominant position to provide limited and restricted access only to its products and services to the remote and unconnected users in the name of providing free and affordable internet. Now that would go against the principle of net neutrality and it goes against competition. So when this initiative was proposed by Facebook, it was strongly opposed by the civil society and as well as by the government. So this clearly showed the power of the public in keeping the behavior of these big tech companies under check. So in conclusion, our approach towards regulating the big tech firms should be very balanced. Yes, there is a need to prevent them from establishing a monopoly, which in fact they already have, and we need to ensure that they do not abuse their dominant position in the market. At the same time, the policies should facilitate the positive externalities and the socio-economic benefits that are offered by the products and services of these companies. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 6 that deals with the rise of China to superpower status And in this context, the editorial calls upon China to display global leadership and lead the world, instead of going down the path of other arrogant superpowers that we have seen in the past. See, this editorial has been published in the context of the ongoing World Economic Forum Summit, and Chinese President Xi Jinping has addressed the summit and delivered a speech which more or less was on the same lines of the earlier speech that he had delivered in 2017. One common trend that we can notice in both the speeches is that Chinese President Xi Jinping has strongly defended globalization, and he has called upon all the global powers to unite and cooperate with each other in order to achieve the common objectives. The earlier speech in 2017 was delivered in the backdrop of Brexit and the election of Donald Trump as the President of the United States. These developments in the West were indicating that the Western countries were slipping towards conservatism and populism, and China saw this as an opportunity to fill the void that was being left behind by the Western powers and display global economic leadership. The Chinese intent was to cement its emergence as a global superpower. The latest speech as well was more or less on similar lines, but it was clearly directed at the United States, and China was seeking to send out two messages in particular to the United States. The first message that can be deciphered from the speech of the Chinese leader at the World Economic Forum is that China has called upon the new Biden administration in the US to abandon the disruptive and protectionist policies that were followed by the Trump administration. As a result of these policies, the United States waged a trade war against China for the last few years and had even targeted the country with trade sanctions. A similar confrontation had been seen between US and China in the world of technology as well, particularly with regard to the rollout of 5G technology. The US has repeatedly alleged that Chinese companies such as Huawei have links to Chinese security agencies, and that the equipment of these companies is bound to be a cybersecurity risk. The US has even gone to the extent of banning several Chinese companies, and it has even gone on to encourage several European countries to adopt similar positions against Chinese tech companies. But China has retaliated against these allegations, and it has blamed the US for misusing its dominant position to protect the market share of American tech companies from Chinese tech companies in the name of cybersecurity and national security. So over the last few years, we have witnessed a very turbulent relationship between the US and China, and they have consistently followed hostile policies against each other. These hostile policies have not just been seen in the economic domain, but they have transcended into the diplomatic domain and as well as into the domain of technology. The second message that China was sending out was against the bloc or alliance building mentality of the United States. This was clearly targeted at American attempts of creating alliances targeted against China, and the Chinese president was indirectly referring to groups such as the Quad, which is being positioned as a diplomatic and military alliance targeted against China. In response to these building of power blocs and alliances, China has said that it displays the Cold War mentality of the United States, which is based on seeking out confrontation and hostility. And according to China, such disruptive policies of the United States in a globalized world is going to hurt everyone. Because in a globalized world, our economies and interests are eventually interlinked and interconnected, and hence the Chinese president has made a case for preventing the bullying of weaker powers by the larger superpowers, and he has called upon the major powers to stay committed to international laws and rules. While these statements of the Chinese president are welcome, it interestingly highlights an inherent contradiction in its policies. Because at the global stage, China is seeking to establish itself as a global economic leader, and it is desperately seeking to fill the void that is being left behind by the Western powers. As the Western economies decline and as their influence recedes, China is looking to step in and fill the power vacuum and establish itself as an economic and military power. But honestly, these statements coming from the Chinese president is quite rich, because China's behavior in its own neighborhood has been nothing but contradictory to these statements. Just take for example the latest border tensions that China has triggered with India along the line of actual control. Then also look at China's aggressive behavior with regard to the ongoing South China Sea dispute and how it has picked up multiple conflicts with Southeast Asian countries such as Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, etc. In this context, China's hostile policies against Taiwan would be a classic example because in this case, China is a larger power that is clearly bullying a weaker power. Even in the East China Sea, China has entered into open confrontation with Japan and South Korea. Over the last 1 decade, China has repeatedly displayed its inability to follow the rules-based world order that has been created through international laws and rules, and it has been aggressively promoting its expansionist tendencies in its own neighborhood. So in this context, the editorial is of the opinion that China should display true global leadership by keeping in mind that it shouldn't turn into yet another arrogant and aggressive superpower as we have witnessed in the past. Now let's take up a few articles that are relevant for prelims. On page number 1, we have an article that makes a reference to the President's address. According to this article, around 18 opposition parties have declared that they are going to boycott the President's address as a result of the undemocratic and unparliamentary conduct of the government. So in this context, let's understand what the President's address is all about. See, under Article 87 of the Constitution, it has been provided that the President shall specially address both the houses of the Parliament. This special address has been provided under 2 particular instances. 1. The President of India addresses both the Rajya Sabha and the Lok Sabha assembled together at the beginning of the first session after each general election. That is basically when the lower house, that is the Lok Sabha, has been reconstituted after a general election. So when the newly constituted Lok Sabha meets for the first time, prior to that, both the houses are assembled together and the President addresses them jointly. The second instance is when the President addresses both the houses of the Parliament at the beginning of the first session of each year, that is, at the beginning of the budget session. When the President's address is being held after a general election, then the President's address will be held only after the newly elected members have subscribed to their oath or affirmation and only after the Speaker of the Lok Sabha has been elected. And please note that until the President's address is completed, no other business is transacted in the Parliament. Now in the other case, where the President's address is mandatory before the beginning of the budget session, what if the Lok Sabha is non-existent? What if the Lok Sabha has been dissolved? Then in that case, then the Rajya Sabha shall meet on its own and continue with its session without having the President's address. This incident has happened once in 1977. So now, what is the purpose or the objective behind the President's address? See, the President's speech that is delivered under these 2 circumstances, it basically highlights and reflects the priorities of the government with regard to its policies and plans for the upcoming year. It is basically seen as a statement from the government highlighting its broad agenda and policy direction, and it provides a sense of government's priorities for the upcoming year. Now the President cannot deliver this speech at his discretion because as per the Constitution, he is bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. But however, he can opt for a few changes here and there, but he would be bound to convey the government's policy priorities and plans as directed by the Council of Ministers. This model of President's address in India has similar references in other parts of the world as well. For example, in the United States, we have the State of the Union address where the President delivers a speech to both the houses. In the United Kingdom as well, the Queen addresses the Parliament when both the houses are assembled together. But the Indian model is largely based on the British model because in both India and the United Kingdom, the President or the Queen, they are just nominal heads or ceremonial heads and they only act as the head of the state and they are not the head of the government or the head of the executive. So we can say that India's presidential address is largely based on the UK model and not on the US model. Following this President's address in India, the speech of the President and the issues that have been brought out are discussed thoroughly in both the houses of the Parliament through a motion known as the motion of thanks. this motion of thanks is taken up in both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. Now this provides an opportunity for the MPs in both the houses to carry out extensive debates and discussions on the policy priorities and the plans that have been highlighted by the government, and they can use this opportunity to even criticize the government for its lapses and failures. Following this intense discussion on the motion of thanks, a few amendments can also be put forward by the opposition parties and they could be accepted, and then the motion of thanks is adopted in the amended form. Finally, at the end of the discussion, the motion of thanks is put to vote, and this motion of thanks must be passed in the Lok Sabha. If it is defeated in the Lok Sabha, then it amounts to the defeat of the government itself, because it expresses the lack of confidence of the Lok Sabha in the government or in the Council of Ministers. But however, this immediately doesn't result in the fall of the government. Instead, it is more of a censure of the government. If the motion of thanks is defeated in the Lok Sabha, then the government cannot act upon its policies and plans, and instead it has to prove its confidence in the Lok Sabha by pushing for a vote of confidence motion. If the vote of confidence is defeated, then the Council of Ministers would be bound to resign, or otherwise the defeat of the motion of thanks in the Lok Sabha would just act as a censure against the government. Whereas in the Rajya Sabha, even if the motion of thanks is defeated, it doesn't have any impact on the government, because eventually the Council of Ministers are accountable only to the Lok Sabha and not to the Rajya Sabha. Next, on page number 1, we have an article that refers to the controversial arrest of comedian Munawar Farooqi in a case related to hurting of religious sentiments. In this case, the comedian has been arrested and placed in jail for several days, and bail has been denied to him. So by looking into his bail application, the Madhya Pradesh High Court has said that the liberty of a person and the person's fundamental right to freedom of speech and expression has to be balanced with his fundamental duty towards other citizens, which is to promote and ensure harmony in the country. The court has felt that the comedian has hurt religious sentiments and disrupted harmony in the society, and on these grounds, bail has been denied to him. So in this context, let's talk about fundamental duties that are enshrined under Article 51A of the Indian Constitution. See, the fundamental duties in the Indian Constitution have been inspired from the Russian Constitution. They were not part of the original Constitution, but they were added later through the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1976 that was adopted during the emergency period based on the recommendations of the Swaran Singh Committee. This constitutional amendment led to the addition of Part 4A to the Constitution and thereby introduced Article 51A, which contains a list of fundamental duties. Originally, there were 10 fundamental duties, but an additional duty was added through the 86th Constitutional Amendment Act of 2002. See, in a democracy, the relationship between a citizen and the state is defined through a contract that we refer to as the Constitution. Through the Constitution, the state guarantees to uphold a set of basic rights, which we refer to as fundamental rights, in order to guarantee to the citizens the rights of justice, equality, liberty, etc. Then the state is also usually provided with a list of directive principles for state policy in order to provide for better governance. In return, the Constitution also expects the citizens to fulfill a few basic duties towards their country. While these fundamental rights are justiciable, the DPSPs and the fundamental duties are non-justiciable, meaning the violation of fundamental duties and directive principles cannot be held as justiciable in a court of law, whereas violation of fundamental rights by the state can be held justiciable in a court of law. But however, you need to realize that there is a fine interplay between fundamental rights and fundamental duties. Because these fundamental rights, they are not absolute. They always come with reasonable restrictions. And as the judiciary has pointed out, responsible citizens are expected to balance their fundamental duties with the fundamental rights that they are enjoying. This slide over here contains the list of 11 fundamental duties under Article 51A. Under this clause, you can find that the Constitution mandates the citizens to promote harmony and the spirit of common brotherhood amongst all people of India, transcending religious, linguistic, and regional or sectional diversities, and to renounce practices that are derogatory to the dignity of women. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: the abuse of monopolistic power by the big tech firms has emerged as a global concern. In this context, bring out the debate on antitrust laws that can check their monopoly while encouraging their positive externalities and consumer surplus. The second question: China should show global leadership and not go down the path of arrogant superpowers. Comment. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.